Tabernacle, Professor of Political Science and Integrated Liberal Studies here at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. This is the fifth installment of our lecture series on conservative political thought. And over the past few weeks, we have read and discussed some writings from Edmund Burke, from some counter-revolutionaries at Demest and Bonalt, from some American women during the Revolution, and last week from Alexis de Tocqueville. And our readings this week, we will turn our attention to the 20th century American thinkers, Russell Kirk and Robert Nisbet. Our special guest this week is Dr. Jeff Paulette. Dr. Paulette is the director of the Ford Leadership Forum at the Gerald R. Ford Presidential Foundation and professor of political science emeritus at Hope College in Holland, Michigan. He's a senior fellow at the Russell Kirk Center and serves on the board of the Front Porch Republic, where he was quite some time the editor of publications. He's the author of works on constitutional law, American political thought, and the American founding, European political thought, education, and other topics. Never does he eschew the frustrations of golf and fly fishing. He and his wife enjoy the bliss of successfully getting 3 children to independent golfing. Go to town, all that.
Really? Thanks, Rick. Where do people usually stand in there? It's here, or right here?
Yeah.
Then I have to see myself on camera. See myself. Nobody wants to see me on camera. Great to be here. It's here at Wisconsin back in September. At a conference here at this very building. And it's the first time I had spoken here. Now this is the second time. And happy to be speaking on a topic that's fairly near and dear to my heart. That's Russell Kirk, especially, but also Robert Nisbet. Russell Kirk is a fellow Michigander, raised in Michigan. Now, I've heard, by the way, that Wisconsin people pretend that they can do the mitten thing to their state, but you can't. That's a Michigan thing. But I'm here in Russell Kirk is here, right in the center field territory. So I want to give you a sort of general introduction to the thinking of Kirk and Nisbet. There's quite a bit of overlap between the way they think about conservatism. But mainly, I want to use their thinking to highlight what I take to be a sort of essential ingredient of conservatism. Conservatism is one of those, well, some of you may remember this. Back in the 90s, the term liberalism had become kind of a dirty term by Democratic politics. So a lot of Democratic leaders decided they rebrand themselves from being liberal to being progressive. And something similar to that's going on with conservatism right now. It is too easily identified in the public mind with the politics of the Republican Party. Most conservatives of the same kind of ilk that I am don't find much of a home for themselves in the contemporary. In an ideal world, we'd be able to rebrand ourselves, but I've not come up with a better term for the conservative. What I want to emphasize in this talk, Rick, could you let me know? Oh, there's a little clock right there. What I want to emphasize in this talk is that conservatism is not an ideology. It's not a political program. It is a way of being. It's a disposition that we have for the world. To highlight this, I want to contrast conservatism with what we might think to be the sort of fundamental features of modern ideologies. Kirk and Nisbet both wrote their the books for which they are most famous. Kirk, Conservative Mind; Nisbet, The Quest for Community, in 1953. In 1954, a political philosopher by the name of Eric Voegelin wrote a book called The New Science of Politics. I want to, and you're not doing anything on Voegelin, are you? I want to use part of Vogelin's argument to sort of highlight what I mean when I say that conservatism is a way of being in the world. Vogelin writes this book in 54. As I said, Kirk and Nisbet write their books in 1953. And they're all writing these books. Leo Strauss writes his Natural Right History in 1953. They're all writing these books in the face of modern totalitarian government. National Socialists in Germany, and then the rise of Soviet communism. And so they become deeply concerned about this problem of totalitarian that are not respectful of individual dignity and certainly not respectful of liberty. And so this is coloring their view of things. And one of the things Vogelin argues in the New Science of Politics is he's asking the question, how did we get here exactly? How did we get to this view of politics as a totalizing kind of enterprise? And that is that the apparatus of the state, which operates by force, can insert itself into every area of human life. That it can control every part of people's lives. And it can take over all the functioning of all other kinds of civil institutions. How did we get to that point? And Vogelin says, well, I think we have to look at this problem of ideology. And he does something a little unusual in the New Science of Politics. And he goes back to the 1st century. And he says, if you want to understand modern political ideologies, you have to go back to the 1st century. The rise of the school of thought known as Gnosticism. This becomes a controversial idea in Vogelin. And whatever the kind of scholarly merits of the claim, I think he's identifying, again, an important set of dispositions or habits on the part of people that he characterizes as Gnostics. First of all, first characteristic they have is they are dissatisfied with the world that they find themselves in. Dissatisfied with the world. Now, if one wants to go about looking for reasons to be dissatisfied with the world, one doesn't have to. Come up with all kinds of reasons why we find reality. So usually it will arise during periods of social dislocation, kind of social chaos. Where there's really no stability in the social order, people feel unsettled. They don't quite know how to make sense of the world around them. And so this leads to this kind of perpetual frustration, anger with the world. From that, second point, Vogelin says, from that they conclude that the world is badly made. It's systemically corrupt. It's systemically bad. The world as we know it is badly made. Again, a lot of times you might just focus on one particular element and say, see right there, that's evidence that everything is wrong in its roots, fundamentally. Third thing, he said, was a common trait among the ancient Gnostics, is they believed that salvation from this badly made world was possible. We could be saved from it. And sometimes that would mean, positing of another world where we would finally attain our salvation. But fourth, he said, the temptation would be the idea that a better world is available, and that in this better world, there will be no more evil. We can purge the world of it. We just have to find kind of one thing that's making it all go. Sort of like Thomas More at the beginning of this utopia. He says, well, if we could just rid the world of greed, then everything would be fine. And so there's always this kind of magic solution. Right? If we can just do this, then we can rid the world of greed. But one of the important points that Vogelin draws our attention to is that the evil is always external. Evil is always external. I'll get back to that in just a second. Okay, so a better world is available, point 4. Point 5, that better world can be brought into the here and now. Unlike in Orthodox Christian teaching, which is the idea that we are in this vale of tears, and the crooked won't be made straight, and the part won't be made whole again until Christ returns and brings in the fullness of the kingdom of God, where sorrow and sighing shall flee away. We can bring that world into here. We don't have to wait for the afterlife for perfection. We can bring the perfection here. So the idea is that this world-changing process is not a rupture at the end of time. It is now a process within time. And then the sixth thing that the people is that you would have a group of knowers. It's gnosis, the Greek verbs for to know. There'd be a group of specialized knowers who could put together a program that would effect this inner worldly salvation, that would effect worldly perfection. And Vogelin says, and that's the kind of structure of political ideology. That you can bring about perfection in the here and now. You can rid the world of evil. So long as you have an enlightened group who have the magic key that can unlock all the problems. And they can put together a program of reform. So they can be either, it could be a sudden program of reform, with the revolutionaries. And change it now. Get rid of throne and altar, and or they can be gradual. The arc of history is bending in a certain direction, but it's all about inner worldly progress. But there's a select group of people who know magic, know how to up. Go back to the beginning. The key to the whole thing, Vogelin says, is this idea that they think the world is badly made. That's the key disposition that political ideologues have. They think the world is badly made, the social world, the natural world, whatever. Contrast this with the conservative position that's being outlined by Kirk and Nisbet, who believe that the world is well made. The world is good. It's we who are broken. It's we who have the problems. It's we who are the source of evil. And that's irremediable, right? I mean, you can't fix that. The only way you could get rid of evil would be to get rid of human beings. And that's one of the things that we find out in political ideologies of the 20th century, is that you can identify a group of human beings who are source of all problems. Then you can cure the social world by just getting rid of that group of human beings. It's a pretty tidy solution. Who says that in the fall? Right? Says that about the Nazis. You have to admire the kind of simplicity and clarity of their solution. They identified the problem, they figured out a way to get rid of it. But since the source of what's wrong in the world is not the world itself, it's us. The fundamental thing that you have to do to make the world a better place is to fix human beings. So one thing, all these conservative thinkers, Vogelin, Nisbet, Kirk, what they all have in common is this idea there's a relationship between the order of the city and the order of the soul. You can't have well-ordered cities without well-ordered souls. And the first imperative we have as human beings is to order our souls. That's the most important. Ordering the city is down the road. We have to prove ourselves worthy of it. But most of our moral energy goes not into improving the world, but into improving ourselves. And that is a difficult and serious enough project for any of us to engage in. One of the things they worry about is that if we start externalizing these moral energies, that our tendency will be, it'll encourage the tendency we have not to engage in self-improvement or to think that we're good people because externalizing the right way, we're making the right appearances, we're showing ourselves rightly to the world, we're involved in the right causes, we have the right sentiments, we have the right ideas, so therefore I'm a good person. They both want to say that's not what makes for good people. Okay, so this is the dispositional difference. Anger and bitterness, because you believe that you've been thrown against your will into a world that is badly formed, badly organized, and gratitude, because you have been thrown against your will into a world that is good, that is filled with good things, and is an occasion for great joy. They both have this sense of contingency. None of us will ourselves into existence. None of us get to choose the time and place of our birth. We're placed in this place at this time. And for a lot of political ideologies, this problem of contingency becomes a problem that has to be superseded. Oh man, I was born in this place in this time. I've got to expand myself because otherwise I'm too provincial. For the conservative, the contingency is cause for joy. I didn't have to be at all, but I am in this time and this place, and as long as I am sufficiently attentive to it, it will constantly and consistently reward my attentiveness. 1953 is when Kirk and Nisbet write their most famous books, Quest for Community by Nisbet, Conservative Mind by Kirk. As I said, they were both concerned about the rising problem of totalitarianism, the ascendancy of political ideologies, and they were both shaped profoundly by their experience in the Second World War. They're very different people. Nisbet was born and raised in California, Michigan, it's not California, it's just kind of, it's really part of the United States. Everything seems different there. Got his doctorate and taught at Cal Berkeley for a while, and then was president at University of California, Riverside for a while, then Columbia University, and then spent his last years in Washington, D.C. as a resident scholar. Handsome, urbane, well-spoken, coastal. And Russell Kirk, born in Plymouth, Michigan, spent his life, did get his doctorate at St. Andrews University in Scotland, taught for one semester at Michigan State University, which he referred to as Behemoth U, and realized he did not want an academic career. Bought an old Victorian mansion in Mecosta, Michigan that belonged to his family, and spent his life there as a man of letters. Wrote books, wrote essays, was a syndicated columnist. Their home, and Russell Kirk, their home became a haven for unwed mothers, for homeless people, for political refugees. It's a rather large estate, and they could possibly bring in people to show their hospitality. Never really left Michigan. He never drove a car. He referred to the automobile as a mechanical Jacobin. And he refused, he never had a driver's license. People had to drive him around, but he never liked going too far. He went for walks every day. As urbane as Nisbet was, that's how eccentric Kirk was. He would walk around town wearing a cape and a cane. And one of my favorite stories about him is one day he was at home and his wife was walking home and she met a hobo, guy who would jump on freight trains going from city to city on freight trains, just park in a certain place, Wallace by name. And that's talking to this guy and he starts reciting 16th century French poetry. And she goes, oh, this is wonderful. She brings him home. He ends up living with them for 25 years. Actually, on and off, he would stay with them and then he would leave and then he would end up in prison somewhere in Alabama or something, and they would bail him out of prison. They'd bring him back up to Michigan. He burned down their home at one point, Ash Wednesday. Can't make that up. And they rebuilt it. And then when Clinton Wallace died, Kirk insisted that he be buried next to Kirk in the Austin Cemetery. And on the tombstone, it says, "Here lies Clinton Wallace, Knight of the Road." That was Kirk's imagination. It was this very romantic kind of imagination. He was in his lifetime better known for his ghost stories than he was for his political essays. He was, according to Stephen King, Russell Kirk is the godfather of American Gothic fiction. He wrote these ghost stories in the 50s and 60s. They're really quite something to read. If you're into ghost stories, yeah, I highly recommend them. Very, very different people. And yet, they end up in a very similar place. You can see that in the writings that you read for the page. They end up in very similar ways of thinking about things. And part of that is the rise of the modern totalitarian state. Part of that is their experience in the Second World War. 1943, Nisbet volunteered for the Army, ended up in the Pacific Theater, fought there for years. Kirk was drafted and was sent to installation in Utah and spent 3 years out in Utah doing some kind of bureaucratic crap that he didn't like at all. And that's the closest he ever came to despair, excuse me, in his life, was 3 years in a military installation. The third thing they were both concerned about was the rise of industrial capitalism. Nisbet mentions this in one of the longer essays that he read, that if you want to find critics of capitalism, you don't have to read Marx. You can go back and read conservative writers from the middle and early part of the 19th century. And you can certainly read conservative writers throughout the 20th century who were deeply critical of what they saw as the dissolving potentials of markets and of especially the cash nexus. Get back to the idea of the cash nexus. So those three things: industrial capitalism, war, and the rise of a centralized state that begins to insert itself into people's lives. So these are the threats. And political ideology becomes the mechanism by which the war state, centralized administration, and industrial capitalisms legitimate themselves. How do you get people to accept these things? You have to have political ideologies to get people to buy into them. So the rise of political ideologies largely operate as both cause and effect with the rise of centralized administrative state, industrial capitalism. floor state. And keep in mind that one of the things they believe is that centralized state and industrial capitalism require each other. These are all symbiotic. You're not going to have one without the others. One of the suspicions that they have is that democracy, whatever we mean by that, and that word's getting thrown around all the time these days, from what I've been given to understand, it's under threat. Every time I pick up a newspaper, it appears there's another threat to our democracy. What they all believe is that democracy is not a solution to these problems. Democracy may very well be a contributing cause to these problems. Nisbet and Kirk are both responsible for the kind of bringing back into American political thinking the writings of Edmund Burke and Alexa. Not many people are reading them at this point, but they go back, they're trying to make sense of the world that they're in, the world within which they find themselves, and they go back and they say, now who has faced similar sorts of circumstances? And how did they think about the world that they were in? And they find Burke and Tocqueville to be the two most profound thinkers. In Burke's case, dealing with the problem of the revolution, and in Tocqueville's case, dealing with the problem of democratic equality. They think that this egalitarian, just as Tocqueville thought, that this egalitarian impulse in democracy actually makes it easier to have a centralized administrative government because it effaces all our differences from one another. It effaces the things that make us distinct and unique. One of the central impulses of the modern state is also one of the central impulses of democracy, they believed, and that is uniformity. All alike and equal, all alike. There's a wonderful book by a political scientist at Yale, James Scott, called Seeing Like a State. If you haven't read it, I will recommend it to you. But one of the things he argues in that book is if you see the world like the state sees the world, what you want to do is eliminate as many differences as you possibly can. You quantify things. You try to gather people, you aggregate populations, you generalize as much as possible. You remove anything that is unique or distinctive. So think about, for example, in statistics, what do? You eliminate the outliers. When you're doing statistical aggregation, you eliminate the outliers. But the outliers, 9 times out of 10, are the most interesting things. So what if your whole strategy is eliminating outliers? This is what Tocqueville kind of thought democracy was doing. It's certainly what their names are too close to what Kirk and Nisbet thought was happening in modern politics. I mentioned the cash nexus. This is an interesting thing for both of them. Kirk lived this at what at one level looks like a very simple life. Austin, Michigan, town of 40 people. Never left home very much, went for walks every day in his cape. But he thought it was a remarkably complex life because it was so fine-grained. You would walk, you would see this person. You knew if you were walking down the street, you would run into so-and-so, and you'd have this conversation with so-and-so. And who knows what was going on in their house that day? Who knows what kind of strangers you might run into and start reciting 16th century French poetry to you. He thought this really granular approach to life was remarkably complex. And that the farther away you got from the way we actually live, the less complex things became, and the more simplified things have become. So the state is always substituting simplicity for complexity. Now, what happens to these communities, these places like Mecosta, Michigan? Kirk says two things are going on, and Nisbet says this also, two things are going on simultaneously. One is the congealing of power in the centralized administrative state. And two is the erosion that is caused by the cash nexus. And that is to try to reduce all human relationships to their cash value. You start commodifying everything, including one another. We're commodifying tastes, we're commodifying ideas, we're commodifying beliefs. Try to monetize everything. Oh, you want to get a what is it? Insta-face account or something like that. Okay, you could be. Do you know about these things? They're called influencers, apparently, and they make money just by being on the interwebs. I mean, it's bizarre. But what have they done? They've kind of commodified their lives. And Kirk and Nisbet both are so concerned about what a cash economy does, because it allows for wealth to be liquidated, and once liquidated, removed and replaced, moved to someplace else. It can be redirected, rerouted. Nisbet talks about this quite a bit, that the cash nexus is a liquidation of everything that is solid in the world. Property, hierarchies, social hierarchies, identity starts becoming fluid. And this congealing of power and this liquidation of things that are otherwise solid and stable allows for the movement of capital and talent away from these communities and toward large urban centers. Nisbet spent most of his life in large urban centers, but he was deeply suspicious of them. Kirk never spent time in them, and he hated them. Certainly, that's what's happened. What do college students do? They follow the flow of capital. They follow the flow of money. They don't go back to the hometowns that they grew up in. They don't go back to those places. They follow the flow. Once wealth and power had become liquid. And this, of course, means that we're destroying all these different places. And think about it in a kind of biological sense. I assume that most of us would think that if there were a species that was endangered and then made extinct, that is something that we would lament. And part of you might say, well, why would we lament that exactly? Who cares if we have snail darters in this world? You say, well, no, it's, there's this wonderful biodiversity, and we don't really know how everything is interconnected with each other. Can you remove one of the species from the globe that have all kinds of effects that can't even get into attention? But in part, we just love the infinite variety of things. We love walking out into the woods. We love walking out into nature and just seeing the infinite variety of things. That's how Kirk and Nisbet thought about the social ecology. There is this wonderful and infinite variety of things, all these different places, all these different communities, where people had been born and lived and made livings and built things, loved each other for decades, if not centuries. These places deserve to live. They deserve to survive. These are good places. And they make America a wonderfully interesting place. You drive through a small town and why is there an opera house in this town of 700 people? And you get out of your car, I know a place exactly like this, because this happened to me. Like, why is there an opera house here? And then you get out and you talk to people and you find out. But those places can't be sustained if the capital city and the other large financial centers are pulling the talent and the wealth out of these communities. And nowhere is this tendency of the modern state to pull talent and wealth out of communities more pronounced than in its war-making. We're going to pull these young men out of these little towns. We're going to send them off to battle somewhere where they might return, might not return. And now you've got these towns and villages and cities that are missing significant portions of their population. You do have Wendell Berry coming in, not Wendell Berry, somebody on Wendell Berry, right? Mark's coming in. Yeah. This is a big thing in Wendell Berry's writing. What happens to these towns when the nation goes to war and people are pulled out of the towns and sent to foreign battlefields? As one senator once said about his experience in Vietnam, I was ordered by people I don't know to kill people I did not hate. I think it's a very conservative sentiment. Nobody wants to be ordered by people they don't know to kill people they don't hate. So how are they going to deal with this? One of the concerns that both of them have, but especially Nisbet, is that the state is going to start appropriating the functions of other social institutions. What's the family? Family has an economic function, traditionally. Family has an educative function, traditionally. Family has a status function. Everybody has a place in the family that also generates a sense of meaning, a sense of purpose, and a sense of belonging to people. These are all parts of the functions of the family. It obviously has a regenerative function. It gives people a sense of belonging, a sense of meaning, a sense of purpose. The authority of the family is intimately related to its ability to perform its functions. If it performs those functions, performs them well, it maintains its authority. But if someone else begins to take those functions over, the authority of the institution is lost in the process. So you'll end up in a world where children won't listen to parents anymore because their parents have lost their authority, because their parents are no longer serving their proper function in the order of things. And Nisbet and Kirk says you can see this with all these social institutions. They all have these functions. Where do these come from? From generations and generations of human experience and trial and error. These didn't drop down from heaven. They're not some kind of master plan that a Gnostic sits in his inner study and draws up. Generations and generations of millennia of trial and error have led human beings to create these social institutions where they can freely associate with one another and create meaning-generating institutions for themselves. And so this is another part of the social world, not only the variety of these places, but the variety of these social institutions. All of them doing different things. All of them an expression of our freedom as human beings in the way that we join together, that we combine together to cooperatively form a social world. And it works as long as their functions are not taken over by something else. And that's the problem with the modern state. The modern state is taking over those functions. They've clearly taken over the educative functions of the family. They've taken over the economic functions of the family. Increasingly, our politics are taking over the meaning-generating functions of the family. So, one of the things both of them believe is that all these other social institutions have to zealously and jealously guard their prerogatives. Even if you think, well, you know, it's kind of actually handy. If the state wants to come in and educate my children, that actually kind of works well for me. I got other stuff I want to do anyway. I've got dollars I have to earn. I've got the cash nexus to be part of. I'll let them educate my kids. What could go wrong? And what they're saying is, like, we're always going to think it's a good idea, and it's always going to be presented as a good idea. But once you go down this path of social institutions giving up their functions, you will end up in a rapid period of deinstitutionalization. So maybe today it's the family, and then tomorrow it's the churches, or it's other social institutions. Right now, we are living in a period of rapid deinstitutionalization. Our institutions are failing across the board. Financial institutions, our political institutions, our educative institutions, our familial institutions, our ecclesial institutions. They're failing across the board. And Kirk and Nisbet kind of provide us with an explanation of that. And that is, they did not zealously and jealously guard their prerogatives. Even if they do it poorly, it's still their job to do it. And there's no guarantee that somebody else is going to do it better. Second thing, along these lines, like how are they responding to this? What did they think was the emerging problem of the age? They're writing in the 1950s. What is the emerging problem of the age that they thought was only going to get worse? Alienation, loneliness. Because once the cash nexus and centralized administration dissolve our ties to one another, now we're set loose upon the world. Nisbet's phrase for this in his book, The Present Age, is we hang loose upon the world. Hang loose upon the world. Connected. We're not attached to things, we are detached. We're not pious thinkers, we're critical thinkers. Critical thinker, by definition, is a thinker who is detached. Word means. Whereas a pious thinker is a person who attaches things, affirms things, embraces things, endorses things, just like Kurt endorsed, embraced Costa, Michigan, and one another. They want to uphold things that they know are good. They want to defend the things they know to be good, they experience to be good. Against the, not just the malicious actors who seek to undo those things, but even worse, the well-intended actors who seek to undo those things because they know better. Nisbet argues that the modern state has essentially engaged in the practice of dismantling our communities. His book, The Quest for the Community, again, he's writing after the Second World War. What's the appeal? Why do people engage in mass politics? Why would they attend the Nuremberg rallies? It's when they become alienated and lonely and isolated that they will now be gathered into one mass force. And they can identify their individual will with the will of the mass. Alone, by themselves, they're powerless, they're helpless. But when they become part of a group, they now take on the identity of that group. They take within themselves the power of that group. Kirk and Nisbet both thought that this was the secret to modern totalitarianism. They gathered all these alienated, atomized, lonely individuals and put them into these massive groups that were going to change the world, that were going to rid the world of evil. And people could ecstatically join these groups and augment their personalities in the process. They become the group in a certain sense. The And for Nisbet, this was testimony to our need for community. So he said, human beings are communal creatures. We will always seek community. But if we won't find good communities, we will join bad communities. We'll become tribal in our politics. Or we'll become totalitarian in our politics. If we don't have healthy communities. And the problem, he said, is that the modern state has dismantled these communities, kind of in the way that I described. And what's more, the institution that dismantles these things will also be the institution that prevents new forms from being born. It will have no interest in reassembling, but neither will it have interest in any new forms being born. So the impulse that human beings will have to freely associate with one another and to create a healthy social realm will either be absorbed into mass politics, or it will be driven underground into new forms of tribalism, often kind of like neo-pagan sorts of forms of tribalism that are resisting the encroachments of the state. The state shifts our allegiances and loyalties. Our loyalties, Nisbet says, go tumbling like tumbleweeds. Not tumbleweeds, that'd be stupid, tumbling like tumbleweeds. Tumbling across the landscape because we're detached from things. We don't know what to really, we owe our allegiance to. We don't know what to be loyal to. And so again, we become more interior. If I don't know what to attach myself to, if I don't know what to be loyal to, then at least I am going to become as self-expressive as I can. All right, I'm running out of time. So how to respond to this? 4 things, I kind of mentioned a couple of them already. One is the revivification of civil society. Multiply your associations and be free, Nisbet wrote. Multiply your associations and be free. Burke once wrote, it is written in the eternal constitution of things that men of intemperate minds cannot be free, their passions forge their fetters. But it's in our associations with one another that we learn how to temper ourselves, how to temper our impulses, how to temper our ideas, how to admit that we might be wrong, how to negotiate with one another. We don't know how to negotiate with 150 million other random people. But in small communities, we can learn how to communicate with each other and how to associate with each other. Multiply your associations to be free, revivify civil society. Secondly, maintaining tradition. Not in the static sense of just defending the static quo. The composer Gustav Mahler once said, tradition is not the veneration of the ashes, but the carrying forward of the flame. We've all been handed a flame from the past that's been handed down from generation to generation to generation to generation. Our job is to tend that flame, keep it from going out while it's in our hands, and to enlighten the world around us and to make it better. Burke, Kirk, Nisbet, they're all adamant about this. This isn't about defending the status quo. You have to have the capacity to change. But you have to change prudently in keeping with the respect that you have for the past. I already mentioned zealously and jealously guarding the prerogatives of people, roles, and places. I had a student once, I was talking about this in class, American government class. She came from a small town in Nebraska, and she said, so are you saying that when I graduate, I can go back to Nebraska, to my town in Nebraska, and I won't be considered a loser? So not as far as I'm concerned, you won't be. But isn't that indicative that that's your reaction? If I go back, I'm going to be a loser because I was the kid who was going places, meaning I'm not staying here anymore. And that kid's going places. Not going to stay here. So if you want to do politics in a really interesting way, go back to your communities and do it there. National politics is boring. I spent a lot of time in Washington, D.C. It's boring. Local politics is actually really interesting. Nisbet and Kirk both, by the way, believe that one of the main pathologies unleashed upon the world by industrial capitalism and by centralized administration is boredom. We will become a generation of hopelessly bored people, constantly looking for diversions, constantly looking for distractions to deal with the fact that we are fundamentally bored because we don't have tasks. We don't have meaning generating tasks in front of us. All this stuff is taken care of for us. We don't know how to do things. You know, we don't know how to produce things anymore. We don't know how to make things, grow things, fix things, kill things, skin them and turn them into and this is very much part of the world that they're in. What Nisbet calls hard property. Both of them celebrate hard property, not cash, hard property. Something, a place where you can stand, a place where you can build something, a place where you can fix something, a place where you can make something, a place where you can grow something. Hard property. That's what creates for self-sufficient people. With tempered minds. Finally, there's the important role of affection. To what do we attach our affections? This is the question that they are ultimately asking. What do we really love? It's just ourselves. That's a problem. It's our political party. That's a bigger problem. What do we really love? And Nisbet and Kirk both say, you can't love what you don't understand. You can't understand what you don't know. And you can't know what you don't see. So what they're inviting us to do is to see the world, not telescopically, but microscopically. See it at the closest level, where we can see and be seen. The upcoming election, you're going to be one of what, 170 million votes? It's pretty inconsequential. It's the least significant thing you will do as a citizen is vote in an election. You're one out of 170 million votes. There are all kinds of demands of citizenship that are highly consequential. Shoveling your neighbor's driveway after he's had a bypass surgery because he can't do it for himself. Cleaning up after your dog. He does his business in somebody else's yard. All these little acts of citizenship that occur because we can see and because we can be seen. We're not anonymous, we're not alienated, we're not isolated, we're not individuated. It all hinges on love. I'm going to leave you with this. It's a passage from Kirk's essay, The Gorgon's Head. Remember, I began by saying, how are we to be in the world? Angry and resentful, or grateful and loving? At the back of every discussion of the good society lies this question, Kirk writes. What is the object of human life? The enlightened conservative does not believe that the end or aim of life is competition, or success, or enjoyment, or longevity, or power, or possessions. He believes instead that the object of life is love. He knows that the just and ordered society is that in which love governs us, so far as love can reign in this world of sorrows. And he knows that the anarchical or the tyrannical society is that in which love lies corrupt. He has learned that love is the source of all being, and that hell itself is ordained by love. He understands that death, when we have finished the part that was assigned to us, is the reward of love. And he apprehends the truth that the greatest happiness ever granted to a man is the privilege of being happy in the hour of his death. Questions? That was okay. Yes, sir.
So to Kirk and Nisbet, they're saying that the world is becoming more alienated.
That we are becoming more alienated in the world.
Okay, and then you also said that people, like, is this, I'm guessing this is still according to them, people would be more likely to join like totalitarian movements or groups when they're alienated.
Yes.
And then, so does that mean that like we will become more totalitarian and see more totalitarianism because we're becoming more alienated?
Yes. Yeah, yeah, this is a pincher effect. That a lot of thinkers, Tocqueville talks about it, de Juvenel talks about it, or Nisbet will talk about it. It's a sort of pincer effect. Where you've got the power of the state on the one hand, and individualism, atomized individualism on the other hand. And what's happening is that whole middle is being eradicated, what we call civil society. And civil society does two things. It acts as a buffer between the citizen and the power of the state. These are mediating institutions. They mediate the power of the state to the individual citizen, just as church mediates God to believers. It pulls individual citizens out of their isolation. Okay. They're joining things. They're being part of something. They're not bowling alone, right? You probably know the bowling alone thing, right? Right. They're joining groups. They're participating in things. And one of the things that they all worried about was the tendency we would have as civil society is eradicated and as the state gains in power, that people will retreat ever more into their private selves. And those kinds of selves are remarkably easy to now consolidate, to collectivize into an undifferentiated mass over which you exercise complete control. Because they're so helpless, they're so powerless, they're so weak. Yes, sir.
Earlier you said that it was suspicious of major cities
Yes.
in a different way than Kirk was because he had experience living in Berkeley and stuff like that.
Yeah.
What was he suspicious about?
In some sense, almost precisely what I was just talking about. That what drives people into the cities is the concentration of power and wealth. That's why they're going there. So both of them, remember I said, it's fundamentally about the order of the soul. Power and wealth corrupt the soul. This is an age-old thing that ethical theorists have talked about forever, the way that power and wealth corrupt the soul. And so there's that. But also it is easier to retreat when you're in large crowds than when you're in small groups. And it's also easier to take on the identity of the crowd that way. When you're in a small group, let's say you're at a town hall meeting with 40 or 50 people, you can't hide. You stand up and talk. It takes a certain amount of courage to stand up and say something. You have to think it through carefully. You're probably going to get pushback. You have to deal with the pushback. These people might be sitting next to you in the pew, or their kid being on a sports team with you. You got to figure out a way to get along with them. But there's no hiding, there's no anonymity. So in the 1950s, there's actually a whole spate of literature. David Reisman wrote a book called The Lonely Crowd. About what's happening and what he saw happening in American democracy in the 1950s. And that is, the more individuated we become, the larger the crowd gets, the more puny and insignificant we become. So they just, the Kirk thought it was just bad for you. It was not a good place for people to live. You know, and there's this old thing, you know, cities are corrupt. You know, they'll corrupt the soul and so forth. And Kirk is he's a romantic in that sense. But I think there's something that we're thinking about. You know, it's, you know, one of the things they both emphasize so much in their writing is that democratic practices are fundamentally practices of mutual dependency. Democracy works well when people are mutually dependent on one another and they understand their dependency on one another. Neighborhoods, I mean, Jane Jacobs writes about this in Greenwich. Like New York City, you don't have relationships of mutual dependency, but on her street in Greenwich Village, when she wrote The Death and Life of the Great American City, that's exactly what she's talking about. Right? That they had developed this system of mutual accountability and mutual dependency. And they were looking out for one another. You know, hey, your kid's in trouble right now. But we find that interfering of, you know, the Budinskis. But she said, no, there's this incredibly thick sociality. And that's a term that both Nisbet and Kirk would use, is that human beings thrive when they are embedded in thick social networks. But when you start pulling all these strands, those networks become really thin. And now we're hanging by a thread. And when we're hanging by a thread, one possibility is anomie, that we descend into a kind of sense of purposelessness. We become despairing, we become depressed, we become anxious, or we become desperate, and we'll grab any thread that is offered to us. But in a really thick social world, we're suspended in a really healthy way. You can pull a thread and we're still fine. You can pull another thread and we're still fine. But if you keep pulling them, after a while, people are going to be in trouble. And they said that, and that's what's happening. We just keep pulling these threads, and now there's no fabric left. Yeah.
So we're in like a state of destruction now, with our institutions all failing. Could you point to a period, like at least in US history, where we had this like civil society, where we had this like deep social network?
Yes, so when Tocqueville tours America, that's the thing that strikes him. Because Americans are amazing at association. So there's a long section in Democracy in America where he talks about the causes that maintain a democracy. And talks about their mores, religion, and the fact that there's no strong capital city. He thinks that's a good thing. But he talks more than anything about association. This is what he sees. I think that there are still places where you can see it. There are periods. Really before the First World War. I think the First World War changed things. Right? That's where we put our government on a permanent war footing. And eager consolidation of the economy and the cash taxes. And those things, yeah, they it's not gone, right? But every study that I have seen on this, for example, I don't remember the exact numbers, but if you ask Americans, how many close friends do you have? And if you ask them this question just 20 years ago, they would have said something along the lines of 7, 8, 10. You ask them now, maybe one. Maybe one. Yes, sir.
But I have over 1,000 friends on Facebook, so that, but I have a different question for you. You didn't really bring up religion for these two thinkers. I wonder if you might comment both on their personal religions and where they see religion fitting into the conservative disposition.
That's an unfortunate question. So Nisbet was not a religious believer. They're both skeptics. But it's a healthy skepticism. There are two ways to be a skeptic. One, you can be a skeptic about yourself. Another, you can be a skeptic about everything else. But never skeptical about yourself. They're both skeptical of themselves. They are skeptical of other things also, of course. Nisbet's skepticism definitely applies to his religious beliefs. He's never, to my knowledge, a communicant in a church. You won't find any references to biblical faith or transcendent ideas in his writing that I've not any that I've read. Excuse me, at least. Kirk is a slightly different story. He how do I want to tell this story? Was not a religious believer. He grew up in a family of theosophists. So they're kind of like seances. You know, he grew up in a household where they were having seances and things like that. He never lost that, actually. He would still do seances and in his old age. If you go up to the house in Mecosta and you meet Annette, his widow, at some point she will say to you, just in the most offhanded way you can imagine, you know, we do have 3 or 4 ghosts here. Tom is the one mainly in the guest bedroom. And you're going, I'm sorry, what? And like, oh, no, we have ghosts. And it's a weird place. Like that house is a weird place. And it's sort of believable in its own way. I'm like, my thing is I've never experienced a ghost, but that's all I can say. Maybe they exist. I don't know. So Kirk had a lot of quirky religious beliefs until he met Annette. And at that point in his life, he was a confirmed bachelor, so in 1963. So he was in his mid-40s. She was younger than him. She was a devout Catholic and imprinted her Catholicism upon him. So there is a debate among Kirk scholars as to how authentic his conversion to Catholicism was. If you talk to Annette, it was deeply and profoundly authentic. And he was very seriously and piously Catholic. If you talk to Kirk's biographer, Brad Berzer, not so much. Kirk always described himself as a Christian Stoic. So what you do have in Kirk, especially, this is in one of those 10 principles that he talks about, this idea of an enduring moral order, transcendent moral order. That's very important for Kirk. And he has that even before his conversion to the Catholic Church. And he does, later on in his life, he does talk more about religion. He thinks religion is all about the proper ordering of the soul. And you can't order the soul properly unless you order it, first of all, properly along a vertical axis, and then order it along a horizontal axis. I mean, you know this better than I do. There's that interesting chapter in Democracy in America where Phil talks about how democratic peoples tend toward pantheism. Because they're so opposed to hierarchies, they'll even collapse that hierarchy. But for Kurt, this is all part of the necessary hierarchy, and Nisbet in his own way also the necessary hierarchy. To the degree that Nisbet talks about religion, it's kind of a functional thing. It's good. It's a good way of restraining the impulses, the passions. As Tocqueville say, the law allows Americans to do everything, but religion forbids them from imagining everything and prohibits them from daring everything. Okay.
You said like a little bit in your talk about like boredom with information of politics.
Yeah.
You like kind of
Say the main themes again.
So, yeah, thank you. This idea of boredom. In a bureaucratic society, everything is regulated. In a lot of ways, the concerns of living are dictated to you. These are things over which, so in other words, the sort of adventure of life where you have to make decisions that sometimes go well and sometimes go badly. You hopefully learn from your mistakes. You're usually engaged in this decision making with other persons, or you're negotiating differences with one another. Or you're engaged in projects and you can see whether the projects are working or not. You're getting your knuckles bloodied when you're turning wrenches, getting your hands dirty from putting it in the dirt. You're part of the world. You're fully in the world. And the world is an interesting place. And so when you're in the world in such a way that your hands are getting dirty and your knuckles are getting bloodied, and your ego is getting bruised, this is good for us as human beings. It's what causes us to grow, but it's inherently interesting. It's just always interesting. But when we're not doing that stuff anymore, when we've specialized tasks and we're allowing others to take care of the concerns for us and we just manage it all from cash, I'm not going to grow my own food. I'll have somebody else. I'll have to pay the money for it. And we're in relatively dull jobs, from which we expect way too much, by the way. We expect our jobs, our careers to give us a sense of meaning and purpose. They're not well designed for that. They're not well designed for that, especially since when we have a job, we are an agent of somebody else's will. Get hired and then tell your boss, I don't want to do that. I don't see it as part of what I need to do, and see how long you last. Right. You become an agent of somebody else's will when you're employed. Yeah.
Sorry, I have a question.
Can I just quick?
Yeah, sure.
So
Yeah,
anyway,
I know.
but when all that stuff's taken, what happened? All the friction of life is removed.
Yeah.
And this is what we want. We want to live in a frictionless world. And a frictionless world is a boring world. And so they think this is what's going to happen. Bureaucracy and the cash nexus is just going to make us, right? We don't know what really to do with our time. We'll be bored, and our boredom will result in either narcoticizing ourselves against it, either through chemicals or through technologies, but whatever, we'll narcoticize ourselves against it, or we will engage in this dangerous gameplay just to prove to ourselves that we're still alive. But we are distracted from distraction by distraction. Yeah, sorry.
Yeah, sorry, yeah, I have no voice today too. Yeah, but it's a different question. Because both like Nisbet and Kirk were part of like the new conservative movement to a certain degree, and which kind of like culminates in the election of Ronald Reagan and his terms presidency, which kind of denies a lot of the things that they are defending. And what were their relationship with like the Reagan administration? It's like a very like pro-market, like big corporation, like very robust foreign policy and active foreign policy, and it was kind of the moment of like a triumph of like free market capitalism, not small communities, So that's
Yeah. So I know more about Kirk in this regard than I do about Nisbet. Kirk had a real gift for friendship, apparently. And he had a he wasn't a political partisan. He made friends across all party lines. So he was a supporter of Barry Goldwater in '64. He became good friends with Malcolm X. He supported Edmund Muskie in his presidential bid. I think he supported Humphrey in his presidential bid. So, I mean, he didn't care about political party. He just sort of thought, okay, is this person going to be pushing things in the right direction, or at least trying to halt the kind of regress that we're in? Especially not Nisbet, but Kirk also, both of them were deeply suspicious of thinking about the government as some sort of moral arbiter. Right, Nisbet is quite libertarian in his politics. Kirk a little less so, although he would have been deeply skeptical of the federal government acting as any sort of moral educator for us. They just don't see that as the role of government to engage in our moral education. Kirk was, both of them were were critics of the so-called global democratic revolution that took place first in the Reagan administration and then later with the two Bushes. They were critics of that. They were critics of the idolization of markets. When Nisbet writes The Present Age in 1985, he's writing this at the height of Reaganomics and Reagan politics. It's pretty critical of them. There's nothing in that book that would make a Reaganite feel good about being a Reaganite. Kirk's relationship to Reagan was a bit different. He had a personal friendship with Reagan before Reagan became president. And as a result, he was able to look the other way a little bit, but he was deeply critical of an expansionist foreign policy. He's very critical of it. The last speech he ever gave was at the Heritage Foundation in 1994, where he went after the Heritage Foundation for its globalized politics, militaristic globalized politics. So Kirk's case, it was a bit more complicated, but Nisbet was quite a critic.
We have time for one more question. I'm going to take a break.
Nice. Not thought-provoking enough.
We have another hour.
Okay, gentleman here has a question.
Okay.
So you began by saying that conservatism is not an ideology. It's a disposition or like a way of being in the world. Don't really know why it's not an ideology. I guess I don't know exactly what an ideology is. What is something that is an ideology? Why is this not?
Okay, that's a great question. See, just needed a little nudge.
Yeah.
It goes back to this idea of Gnosticism. That an ideology is a systematic way of thinking about reality that involves has attended to it high degrees of certainty. So you know what the problem is and you know how to fix it. And you've got a program in place for fixing it. So there are systematized ways of thinking about the world and how to fix the world. So Vogelin's thing about a political ideology is that they're always predicated upon this idea that the world needs to be fixed, and there's a group of people who know exactly how to fix it. What you get in people like Kirk and Nisbet is, well, okay, the world's fundamentally good. Now we've messed it up. And we should try to make sure that we fix what we've messed up and not mess it up more than we already have. But we really, you know, you have to be awfully audacious to think you've got the answer. Or that there's a system of thinking that's comprehensive, that covers everything. You know, conservatives are always impressed by the law of unintended consequences. They think that that's what really governs politics. Kirk in that one essay says the conservative will always prefer the devil he knows to the one he doesn't. Yeah, this is bad, but we got to be careful before we do something. You know Chesterton's fence. This idea from G.K. Chesterton that like an urban planner comes along and they're planning a road and they run into a stone fence, and their first impulse is to get rid of the fence because it's in the way. And Chesterton says what they should ask is, why is the fence there? Who put it there? When did they put it there? Again, why did they put it there? Maybe it's serving a really important purpose that you don't know. And you need to know all these things before you can just go forward. But the ideologue is like, boom, we're going to build the road. Fences in our way. Chesterton wrote a novel, a really wonderful novel called The Napoleon of Notting Hill. And it's about the English government wanting to build a road through the Notting Hill district of London. And it's kind of like Jane Jacobs with Robert Moses in New York City. You're not going to build a highway through my neighborhood. And the people in the neighborhood, they organize themselves. And for the people who are the agents of progress, they don't care about Notting Hill. Robert Moses didn't give a crap about Greenwich Village. He had this vision. Robert Moses displaced over 500,000 people when he built the interstate highway system around New York City. He didn't care about them. He was consumed with this vision of progress, of economic and social progress. And he could see the future. And the automobile was going to be the thing that got us into the future. And these pesky little neighborhoods, and especially Jane Jacobs, they just got in his way. And he did everything he could. I'm from Michigan. Anybody else from Michigan? In here? Not too bad. The city of Detroit in the 1940s and 1950s had the largest and healthiest Black middle class of any city in America. Until the believers in progress thought, you know what we really need is an interstate highway that makes it possible for us to move. And by the way, the interstate highway system, the original bill by Eisenhower was called the National Defense and Military Preparation Act, so that you could move troops and materials quickly. But now it's about the economy. So who are the beneficiaries? Walmart's a beneficiary. Home Depot's a beneficiary. Who are not the beneficiaries? The people who own local businesses that got plowed under by the bulldozers that paved the way for the interstate highway system. The neighborhoods, the whole Black community in Detroit that was now cut in half by I-75. For someone like Kirk, this is a tragedy of unspeakable proportions. And why do we do it? Because progress. It's going to be good for the economy. But what we're doing is we are taking on absolutely certain costs for promised benefits. We don't know if we're ever going to enjoy the benefits of that, or if somebody does enjoy the benefits, whether any of us will. But this is always innovation. The spirit of innovation is always asking you to take on certain costs for uncertain benefits. And the conservative says that's a bad deal. That's a bad deal. I'll accept change because change is going to bring with it certain compensations. And I'll accept the losses if there are compensations that come along with it. But I'm not going to let you upset things on the basis of promissory notes that you don't know you can cash. Right, but the ideologue is consumed with this fervor, this conviction that they can see the future. I've seen the future and it works. And they've got the plan to get us there.
Is conservatism unique in this regard?
I think it is at least the fullest sort of explication of that. Kirk loved telling this story. He would go for walks and he would see this woman and her son tending potatoes out in the field. And he would think about this all the time and just what was all implied in that kind of economy. That mother and son are spending a day in the field together, enjoying one another's company, getting to know each other, having purpose, engaged in a communal project. And he related that to a story between two economists. One, Ludwig von Mises, who is this kind of libertarian free markets, right, one of the great free market economists, and Wilhelm Röpke, a German economist who thought that a healthy economy had a widespread distribution of property. It didn't have the concentration of capital into the hands of ever smaller groups like we're seeing now. It had a widespread distribution of property. So they're walking along one day and they see some people tending a garden. And von Mises says, what an inefficient way of producing foodstuffs. And Röpke replies, perhaps, but a very efficient way of producing human happiness. That's the conservative disposition. It's not about, how do we maximize value? How do we commodify things? How are we efficient? How do we do things efficiently? It's how can we do things in such a way that human beings flourish and are connected with one another? That's the disposition. Right.
We will have our 10-minute break, reorganize the tables and reconvene 5 past 4.